The Ukrainians are reporting that they have successfully launched a counteroffensive in the Donetsk region. Just is this the start of something bigger, or even more troubling for Russia, is this a sign that the Russian army isn't exactly all it's cracked up to be? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So, this is a really interesting story, not necessarily because it is a huge, large scale counteroffensive, but the Ukrainians have reportedly launched a counterattack in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and released a bunch of footage from the 141st Mechanized Brigade hitting this assault in the Sychevne region in eastern Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, inflicting some territory and driving back Russian forces, right? They said that reportedly up to 50 Russian troops were killed, 8 taken prisoner, as part of a series of attacks into settlements in the area, right? The area reportedly is on the administrative border with Donetsk Oblast and has become a focal point of Russian offensive actions, right? Now, this is notable because Dnipropetrovsk Oblast is not part of, these Russian claims, right? It's the borders, I think, are right here. And this is kind of unusual in that Russia doesn't have a territorial claim. In fact, its latest propaganda has said that it's only fighting for Kherson, basically Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and Donetsk oblasts. So the fact that they're now into another oblast, not just one, but 2 other oblasts, in fact, they're also into Sumy and into Kharkiv. The fact they're doing this really flies in the face of that, because you would think that given the massive Russian resources that are deployed to try to take these remaining contested regions, you would think that once they reached the administrative borders of Donetsk, they would have stopped. They would have been like, yo, dig in. Because, as we point out, right, like, I'll try to show you guys here some of this Ukrainian offensive stuff, right? Like, we're not talking about a large scale offensive by any stretch of the imagination, right? But it is small, localized counterattacks in some of these regions here. Yeah. And like it shows that Ukraine still has offensive tools. It has tactics to conduct some level of offensive operations. Again, it's not like large in scale, but what I just think it's fascinating that the Russians are choosing to continue this offensive. And for them, it indicates that they really aren't here to try to just liberate Novo Russia or whatever bullshit thing, right? They want to simply get the entire Ukrainian government to capitulate or collapse. And I don't think that is happening. But what I think is more interesting is that, the Russians maintain that they have an overwhelming material and manpower advantage, and that Ukrainian offensive efforts are sort of in vain, and that once they take territory, they never get rolled back. But all of that has just not been the case, right? We've talked about the fact that there was this bizarre Russian breakthrough several weeks ago, leading into the Trump-Putin meeting. And while this happened, the Russian military was unable to hold it, and that the Ukrainians have basically sliced it to pieces, turning it into basically a 13-kilometer kill zone, where Russian forces probably are still sort of hunkered down and hiding out and isolated and cut off. And the fact that you're seeing similar actions here all says that this is like the idea of the superior Russian army, the Russian army grinding Ukraine into dust, it just isn't happening. The Russian army seems to be sputtering just as hard as, at least as hard as the Ukrainian army, possibly more so, given that the Ukrainians, again, are just not assuming the kind of losses that the Russians are. Remember, we heard just a few days ago, right, the Russians claiming they were totally going to be taking Kupiansk, but you can see that they've basically also stalled out in this weird kind of encirclement fight. It's like this kind of everywhere. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are winning, that the Russians lines are going to collapse. But what it says is that, like, the inevitable grinding Russian victory, it sure doesn't look that way. it sure looks like the Russians are probably going to run out of willing volunteers, possibly before the Ukrainian military runs out of people willing to fight. Because on the Ukrainian defensive side, remember, a lot of this area is not even necessarily held by infantry primarily. These are primarily drone kill zones, right? That by some stories indicate are up to 10 kilometers deep of just no man's land, where Russian positions and Ukrainian positions are sort of interspersed, but heavily manned by, well, unmanned vehicles, unmanned drones. And the Russians continue to have to mobilize people and throw them into these kill zones, whereas the Ukrainians man them, but they do not need to conduct these offensive actions. So is this like the destruction of the Russian army imminent? No. But also worth saying, is the collapse of the Ukrainian lines imminent? Not even close. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, folks like AL90, James Porsche, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, William Alex, Henry Roussier, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. Couldn't do it without you guys. Hit subscribe and join us over on Combat Vet News and support the channel. Thanks a lot. Hit subscribe.